Trigger warning. This story contains themes of domestic abuse and poisoning, why the doctor urged her to get a divorce after reviewing her ultrasound. At 20 weeks, Elizabeth went for what should have been an ordinary milestone. The anatomy scan that maps a growing life, the appointment when expectant parents hear a steadier heartbeat and see the small, astonishing shape of a baby inside the womb. She had been married 12 years. Her husband, Timothy, had backed out of the appointment at the last minute. An email that read, "Can't make it, work emergency," and a shrug in person later. But Elizabeth went alone because going alone had become, lately, the path of least resistance. She walked into the clinic with a practiced calm, the pale sweater she liked, her hand threaded through a worn leather folder of prenatal records. The waiting room smelled like disinfectant and coffee, and a small poster about folic acid looked, suddenly, like a promise. The sonographer, warm, routined, glided a gelled wand across her belly. On the screen, a flickering shadow answered with the thud-thud of a heartbeat. The baby moved, and Elizabeth let out a laugh that was mostly relief. Dr. Marianne Chen watched the monitor, with a clinician's quiet focus. She'd been Elizabeth's OB-GYN for 5 months, the calm, steadying presence who had explained each test and scribbled notes when Elizabeth asked questions. That day, Dr. Chen's face shifted in a way Elizabeth had not seen before. Not alarm, but a careful, deliberate narrowing, as if she were listening for something beneath the regular rhythms. The ultrasound report was, at first glance, good. The fetus showed normal measurements. The placenta's position was not worrying. But Elizabeth's blood tests were another story. They showed a pattern that did not fit the clean arc of a simple prenatal deficiency. The numbers suggested nutritional deficits and signs of placental insufficiency. Phrases that sat in Elizabeth's ears like terms from a foreign language, heavy and imprecise. Dr. Chen explained them slowly, but what mattered most was the pause between her sentences and the way she folded a piece of paper into Elizabeth's palm when the conversation turned from clinical to urgent. "It could be a pattern we sometimes see when a patient isn't getting what she needs," Dr. Chen said, and then softer, less clinical. "Sometimes it's not the body failing on its own. Sometimes something outside the body is interfering." Elizabeth remembers the words as if they were small stones dropped into a quiet pool, ripples running outward. She asked, "Like what?" And Dr. Chen didn't offer a list. She didn't need to. She offered instead something immediate. A shelter card folded inside that same note, a gentle, direct suggestion that Elizabeth consider leaving that night. "Go somewhere safe tonight," Dr. Chen said. "I can't prove anything now, but I'm worried for you and for the baby. If you want, we can connect you with resources. You don't have to make a decision about anything permanent tonight, but you need to be somewhere you can control what you eat and what you take." Those words lodged themselves like a splinter. Elizabeth's first reaction was disbelief. Her second was denial. Her third was a dizzy rationalizing that had, over the years, grown into a habit. Timothy loved her. He was not cruel in obvious ways. He remembered birthdays in a way that felt like salvation. He held the baby's first ultrasound photo in the way men hold fragile things they plan to protect. He had never raised a fist. He had, for much of their marriage, been a person who occupied both the small, ordinary places of companionship and the larger, more controlling spaces that Elizabeth had learned to call his management. The two could exist at once. She knew that. She also knew, with a growing, terrifying clarity, that medical evidence did not care how long you'd been married. Before she left the clinic, Dr. Chen's assistant set a time for follow-up blood work and said, mildly, that sometimes these markers correct themselves. Sometimes, Elizabeth thought. When she stepped outside, the sun was thin, and the city smell, exhaust and hot pavement, no longer felt neutral. Her fingers closed around the card Dr. Chen had given her. She could fold it, toss it, ignore it like a misplaced receipt. She could frame it in memory with a note that said she'd been cautious, grateful, and then returned home to the life she'd always known. Instead, Elizabeth carried the card in her jacket pocket. She rode the bus home thinking of how the doctor had watched the monitor, how Dr. Chen's lips had tightened. She thought of other small things she had ignored in the past year, the way Timothy tightened his voice when she made plans without him, how he curated what they ate, how he took charge of her prenatal vitamins and the tiny rituals of their days. He would make her tea, send her to bed with a plate of hot soup, check the temperature of the house like a man who measured caretaking by control. And in the quiet of their kitchen she dared to imagine, that something as ordinary as a spoonful could be a dividing line between health and danger. At home, Timothy noticed the card. He rifled through mail and said, half smiling, "Doctor's orders?" He kissed the top of her head. He spoke about the baby in kindly shorthand. "Think of the nursery color." He was careful, charming, and efficient. Traits that had comforted Elizabeth through unpleasant landlords, job changes, the small economic instabilities of their life. That night, Elizabeth did not sleep. She told herself that doctors sometimes think the worst. She told herself that certainty would come with more tests. But there was a tremor in the way she set the prenatal vitamins on the counter the next morning, and when Timothy reached for them without asking, she said simply, "I'll take care of these." He looked surprised, and then, with a softness that almost undid her, he said, "You sure I can do it? I like making sure you take them." "I'd like to," she answered, and the ordinary negotiation became its own kind of revelation. She started to notice the small rituals again, his insistence on choosing her meals, the way he always had the last word on whether they went to family events, the quiet commentary on how she dressed or who she spoke to. Each tiny thing was not proof. Each was a fact in a ledger that, when added up, suggested a foundation that was not as solid as she had believed. Elizabeth's instinct was not to explode or to confront, at least not at first. She went to her oldest friend, Jasmine, who had watched the marriage from another angle. Jasmine, who had a laugh that filled rooms and a habit of asking direct questions. Jasmine met Elizabeth at a coffee shop that smelled of roasted beans and orange peel candles. Elizabeth sat with Dr. Chen's card in the palm of her hand like an accusation she could neither make nor dismiss. When Elizabeth spoke, she kept her voice low. She tried to be clinical. "The doctor thinks something external might be affecting my lab results," she said. "She said I should get out for the night." Jasmine's face hardened into a concern that was not performative. She reached across the table and took Elizabeth's hand with a steadiness that felt like insurance. "We don't have to decide anything yet," Jasmine said. "But you deserve to feel safe. If Dr. Chen is worried, we listen." They talked for hours, sometimes in whispers. Elizabeth told Jasmine about the vitamins Timothy handled, and the dinners he insisted on picking up late from the store. She described the fatigue that had seeped into her bones the last few months, the kind that did not vanish with sleep. She told Jasmine how Timothy had smiled when she expressed worries in the past, as if her anxiety were a private weather system to be managed. "Do you think he would hurt you?" Jasmine asked, not to alarm but to understand. Elizabeth's answer was not a single yes or no. "I don't know," she said. "I keep thinking about the doctor's face. It felt certain." Jasmine didn't debate eloquently. She offered options not as commands, but as modalities. Reach out to the clinic, get a second opinion, sleep at her apartment for a night, consider keeping food separate for a while so Elizabeth could tell if anything changed. Importantly, Jasmine insisted on being present, not to rescue Elizabeth, but to hold the edges of the choice-making so that Elizabeth could act from her own judgment. They moved slowly. The plan was not dramatic. Elizabeth's life had no cinematic snap of revelation and escape. It had incremental experiments and cautious boundaries. For 3 days, Elizabeth began to change the small routines that had once been invisible. She declined Timothy's prepared meals without announcing the reason. She started to carry her own water bottle and kept the prenatal vitamins tucked into a travel pouch she carried in her bag. She ate the salad she had prepared at lunchtime at her office, away from home. On day 3, she sat in Jasmine's kitchen and noticed that the heavy fog of exhaustion that had blurred her mornings seemed lighter. She could climb a single flight of stairs without stopping, and the black ring of fatigue around her eyes had softened. These were not dramatic healings. They were, instead, the literate shifting of a body that felt itself recognized. Elizabeth told herself to be skeptical of causation. She read articles that said placebo effects were real, that rest could explain a lot. But she also kept a small journal, a method Jasmine insisted upon, where she noted what she ate, when she slept, and how she felt. The entries were plain. Day 1, anxious, heavy. Day 3, less tired. Went for a walk. The journal became less a project and more an archive, a modest ledger that could, in time, show patterns. Their testing was careful to avoid theatrics. Elizabeth did not want to escalate unless she had reason to. She photographed the vitamins in their bottle, she saved a few meal receipts, and she recorded in a private voice memo the way her hands had trembled entering and exiting restaurants where Timothy had chosen the menu. She was not planning for fame or news. She was building, slowly and quietly, a track of evidence she could show to a doctor or to police, if it came to that. At night, she would place a solitary spoon on the counter and think of it as a tiny witness. Wordless fear lived in the house like an extra person. Elizabeth paid attention to the rhythms of Timothy's comings and goings. He worked late shifts that sometimes became erratic. He questioned why she was suddenly more particular about food. He watched her with a look that was sometimes tender and sometimes calculating, a look that could be mistaken for concern if you missed the calculation beneath it. One evening, he reached for his keys and said in passing, "You don't need to be so paranoid. Doctors scare people sometimes. What if it's more than fear?" she said, and it was the first time in years she had addressed him with a voice that was not thin with deferment. He laughed, a small sound. "Of course it's more," he said. "Everything's more dramatic now that there's a baby." What she feared was not drama. What she feared was that a pattern, small and intentional, had been shaping itself around her health. And what Dr. Chen had seen in the tests, the dissonance between fetal growth and maternal depletion, could be the body's alarm, a subtle signal that something in the day-to-day was not as it should be. Back at the clinic, Dr. Chen had been careful. She had not made accusations. She had mailed the test results to the lab for a more detailed look. She had asked Elizabeth to come back in 4 days for repeat blood work and had set up a discreet referral to Grace House, the shelter she trusted. "You don't have to leave forever," Dr. Chen said. "You leave for now because you need a controlled environment. You'll see if your body responds when you're not under the same conditions." That language, controlled environment, meant something to Elizabeth that it had not meant before. There was a precision to the doctor's suggestion, not a moral judgment, but a practical frame. It also contained an implied arc. If leaving for a night made the numbers shift, that would be information. If the numbers shifted and stayed shifted, that would be evidence of a pattern external to her body. And if that proved true, the next step would be about safety in a different register, legal action, accountability, the possibility of divorce. Dr. Chen had said the last word quietly, not as a command, but as a likely eventuality if the pattern were confirmed. Some people stay despite everything, Dr. Chen told her, because of history, fear of the unknown, financial dependence. But the risk to a pregnancy is real. If we can demonstrate a pattern of interference, that changes the options you have. It makes your safety more enforceable. Elizabeth left that appointment feeling a new kind of weight. It was not only the weight of potential danger, but also the weight of decision. She had to choose how to gather proof without exposing herself to immediate retaliation, how to keep the baby safe, and how to carry on appearances in a marriage built on both genuine affection and subtle control. She was not a woman who had expected to have to gather evidence against her husband. She had expected, like most people, that devotion and shared history would be the scaffolding of a solution when things went wrong. Now she was learning the language of suspicion in a voice that felt foreign inside her own head. In the days that followed, Elizabeth and Jasmine refined their approach. They did not plan out an elaborate forensic operation. They planned careful boundaries. Jasmine stayed over for a night, then two, so Elizabeth could sleep in a place where she chose her meals. They videotaped, in the most mundane way, the labels on vitamin bottles and the receipts for food Timothy bought. They saved a few small items in sealed bags, not because they were trained to collect evidence, but because they wanted some way to show a pattern if Dr. Chen's return test suggested one. On the fourth day, the clinic called with the repeat blood work. Dr. Chen asked Elizabeth to come in. Elizabeth felt, as she sat in the small exam room, an odd combination of dread and relief. If nothing had changed, she would have to reckon with that, and with the possibility that she had misread the situation. If things had changed, she would have a fragile kind of confirmation that felt like another person's help in a life she still occupied. Doctor. Chen entered carrying a folder and something like professional tenderness. The numbers changed, Dr. Chen said. Some markers moved toward normal. It's not definitive on its own, but when I see that pattern after a patient has removed themselves from the prior conditions, it raises concern about external manipulation. For your safety and the baby's, I still strongly advise you to get somewhere safe tonight. Elizabeth sat there in a quiet that felt like the space between catching a breath and stepping forward. If I leave tonight, what happens next? She asked. Dr. Chen gave her an answer that was practical, not prescriptive. We can document everything. We'll run the tests again in a week. If you want, I'll call a patient advocate who can help with temporary housing. If the pattern continues, we'll connect you with legal support. You have options, Elizabeth. This is about giving you room to feel safe. Those words, options, were a small revolution. They opened a sliver of possibility where Elizabeth could act not out of panic, but from a place of evidence and support. She asked Dr. Chen if she could be there when Elizabeth told Timothy. Dr. Chen, with an expression emblematic of her clinical ethics, said no, she could not be the messenger in a personal confrontation. But the doctor did offer to write a note for work that would explain a sudden overnight absence and to provide a direct line to a resource coordinator who could help with shelter and logistics. Elizabeth drove home in a car that felt suddenly large, with significance. She thought about the baby's movement in her ribs and about the small, ordinary rituals that defined their house. That night, she made a plan that balanced caution and resolve. She would not announce everything. She would take her bag packed with essentials and drive to Jasmine's. She would leave a brief message. I'm staying with a friend tonight. She would not tell Timothy the entire reason. She would instead ask for the space to see if the pattern held. When she packed the bag, there was an absurd intimacy to choosing items. The robe she liked, a small picture of her mother, a set of pajamas, the prenatal vitamins she put in a little cloth pouch. She folded a few of Timothy's shirts and put them back in the closet where he would find them. She did not want to leave like an accusation, so much as a person taking temporary refuge. That night in Jasmine's apartment, they made a simple ritual of tending to her body. Jasmine prepared a soup that felt like a promise. Plain, nourishing, nothing too complicated. Elizabeth ate slowly, paying attention as if the act of tasting could become an instrument of evidence. Over the next 48 hours, she slept more soundly. The exhaustion that had been a constant presence loosened its grip, like a hand that releases a wrist. There were no grand epiphanies, only the steady accrual of small changes. She called Dr. Chen, who recommended another blood test in a week and offered to coordinate with Grace House if Elizabeth chose longer-term shelter. Elizabeth was not naive. She knew that one set of improved numbers might be an anomaly, but she also knew that the improvement, combined with the pattern Dr. Chen had described, allowed her to breathe in a way she had not been able to breathe for months. The decision to leave, to test her life against a controlled environment, had given her one kind of answer. The other answers, legal, moral, and relational, would take time. She drove back to the house to collect more items and to be sure she hadn't left anything important behind. Timothy was at the kitchen table, the light catching the silver at his temples. He smiled when he saw the bag. "Everything okay?" he asked. "Yes," she said. Her voice did not tremble. "I stayed with Jasmine. I needed a few nights to rest." His brow furrowed, and his reaction was a careful mixture of concern and controlled irritation. "Why didn't you tell me? I could have rearranged work. We should coordinate better." "I'll tell you when I'm ready," she replied. "I need a little more space right now." He nodded, as if the word space were a reasonable request coming from a romantic subplot in which both partners agreed to intermissions. He kissed her forehead, and she left the house feeling, paradoxically, both lighter and more exposed. That afternoon, while Timothy was at work, Elizabeth sat with her phone and composed a message that felt like a contract with herself. She wrote down a list of things she would do if the pattern appeared in their life again. Keep records, call a trusted friend, contact the clinic. She made copies of receipts, photographed the vitamin labels, and tucked one photograph into the folder she had taken to Dr. Chen. She did not imagine a dramatic court case or a television profile. She imagined instead a quiet, methodical accumulation of facts she could use to protect herself and her child. As the days passed, Elizabeth's body continued to adjust. She took walks with Jasmine and noticed that her steps had regained a certain bounce. She started to laugh more easily, but laughter did not erase the memory of Dr. Chen's face when she had suggested leaving. It did not erase the card in Elizabeth's pocket or the way Timothy had smiled at her in a way that had once felt like shelter and now sometimes felt like a calculation. In quiet, alone moments, she tried to map the timeline. 12 years of marriage, a dozen small compromises, the gradual ceding of decisions to one person who used care as a currency to control. She thought about how easy it had been to misread the signs until a professional, with clinical distance and a readiness to act, had named a possibility that Elizabeth could not have named for herself. Jasmine would later say that Elizabeth was a pragmatic hero, no sudden act of bravery, but a string of small ones. Refusing a spoon, keeping a friend's sofa for a night, photographing labels, calling a clinic. These acts were not dramatic, but they were urgent, and they fit the reality of how people leave coercion, rarely with fireworks, more often with a calendar and a list. Even as she collected evidence, Elizabeth felt shame, an old and complicated feeling that seemed to come from an ancient ledger of expectations. She wondered at times whether friends and family would understand her decision if she left permanently. Would they ask why she had waited? Would they judge the years she had invested in a marriage that held both tenderness and restraint? The shame sometimes stuck like gum to her thoughts. But then she would remember the little notes Dr. Chen had written, the way the doctor had folded a piece of paper into her palm and said, "Go somewhere safe tonight." The doctor's voice was not one of judgment. It was calibrated to urgency. 3 days before Elizabeth planned to return for more tests, she and Jasmine sat in Jasmine's living room and spoke about what would happen if the pattern was confirmed. Jasmine was unflinching in a way that felt like armor for Elizabeth. "You don't have to fix everything now," she said. "You don't have to know what divorce would mean in 5 years. You need to know what keeps you and the baby alive now. That distinction between immediate safety and long-term decisions reoriented Elizabeth's thinking. The idea of divorce had been a distant possibility that felt more like an accent on a dictionary page than a real option. But Dr. Chen had not said it as an idea to be feared. She had said it as a potential step on the path from danger to safety. That reframing made it less ideologically loaded and more pragmatically real. When Elizabeth went back to the clinic, the new blood work again suggested improvement in the markers that had alarmed Dr. Chen. The pattern was repeating, numbers moving in the right direction after Elizabeth moved herself to a controlled environment. Dr. Chen, who had been careful and methodical from the start, began to make the implications explicit in a way that balanced urgency with respect for Elizabeth's autonomy. This pattern suggests external interference is possible, Dr. Chen said. If you are comfortable, I'd like to document this formally and refer this to our patient advocate and a forensic lab that can analyze the substances. There's a process to ensure we have evidence if you decide to pursue legal action. Elizabeth felt the wind of a larger consequence. Legal action, a forensic lab. The words sounded both foreign and necessary. Dr. Chen continued, "If the interference is confirmed, you'll have grounds to seek protective orders and, if you choose, to pursue divorce as a legal step that separates you and protects your child. I know that's a lot." "It is," Elizabeth said, "but I have to know. Then we'll proceed carefully," Dr. Chen answered. "We'll document every step. You're not alone in this." Elizabeth left the clinic with more than a card in her pocket. She carried a sense of alignment between what her body had been telling her and what a trained observer now confirmed. She had evidence that, while not yet conclusive, demanded action. The doctor's suggestion to leave that night had been the first urgent nudge. Now the recommendation that she consider divorce, if patterns confirmed interference, felt like the long arc of a medical professional moving into the ethical territory of advocacy. Elizabeth did not leap into any rigid decision. She returned to Jasmine's apartment, and they made plans for a public meeting. Not to confront yet, not to attack, just to set a stage where witnesses could exist and where Elizabeth could exert control over the narrative of her life. They settled on a cafe near Timothy's office because it was neither their house nor his realm. It was a public place where words could be said with others around. Elizabeth wanted, in a strange and practical way, for the conversation to be witnessed. She wanted someone else to hear his tone, his words, his denials, because private exchanges had often allowed for manipulation to be rewritten later. "You need him to say it in front of people," Jasmine said. "You need witnesses." Elizabeth liked the sentence because it sounded like a map. Words plus witnesses plus consequence. It was not a guarantee of a neat resolution. It was a step toward the possibility of accountability. On the morning they set the meeting, Elizabeth sat in her car and breathed in the cool, sharp air of a day that felt like a hinge. Behind her eyelids flitted the faces of small friends and large professionals. Dr. Chen with her folded piece of paper, Jasmine with her steady hand, the clinic staff who had not editorialized but had offered resources. In the glove compartment, Elizabeth kept a folder with copies of lab results, receipts and photographs, evidence she had amassed not to punish, but to protect. She drove to the cafe where she would meet Timothy, and thought of how a doctor's measured concern had shifted the axis of her life. The doctor's words, "Go somewhere safe tonight," had seemed radical then, and formed the first concrete move that allowed Elizabeth to see her own life in terms that included safety. The further suggestion that if the pattern continued, divorce might be necessary, had sounded like a finality she wasn't ready to accept. Yet it was precisely that ellipsis of possibility that made everything urgent. Elizabeth parked, smoothed her hair, and felt the ring on her finger for a second that felt like a fossilized habit. She rehearsed nothing and everything at once. To be clear, to be calm, to hold witnesses. She thought of Dr. Chen's face and the way the doctor had chosen words with both clinical precision and human tenderness. She thought of the baby moving inside her, small and indifferent to the legal and moral complexities adults were trying to sort. There was one more thing she needed, for him to say it, for Timothy to articulate a motive or a reason that tied together the small daily control and the pattern of medical interference. It was not enough, she knew, to live with suspicion. Suspicion, without articulation and witnesses, could simply be a private, unresolvable grief. She needed the story to be heard aloud in public, because public words have consequences. She stepped out of the car and walked into the cafe, the bell over the door jangling as if to announce a simple, ordinary meeting between two people who had made many ordinary agreements that now required re-examination. Inside, the tables buzzed with unrelated lives, people with laptops, couples reading newspapers, a child dropping a muffin. Elizabeth sat near the window and watched the door. She felt the familiar current of fear, but also a new kind of determination. If the doctor's urgency had been the first signal that her life needed to be rearranged for safety, this meeting felt like the next step in how she might reclaim the narrative of her own body and the life growing inside her. She watched the door, aware that the outcome was not yet written, and that Dr. Chen's suggestion that leaving and, if necessary, divorce could be the path that saved them both. The bell above the cafe door tinkled, and Timothy walked in like a man who believed the world still belonged to him. He scanned the room, paused when he saw Elizabeth, and then sat with a casualness that was practiced, shoulders relaxed, a smile that could be folded down into charm when needed. Jasmine was already there, hands folded around a mug, her posture an unspoken pledge. Two other friends sat at a nearby table, having been asked to be there not as an audience but as witnesses. For a moment the room felt ordinary, the hiss of the espresso machine, a child laughing in the corner, and Elizabeth clung to that ordinariness like a raft. She had rehearsed nothing and everything. She had the folder in her lap, the photographs, the receipts, the lab copies pressed between pages. They were not dramatic artifacts. They were the quiet things someone collects when they are trying to make the world accountable. "Hey," Timothy said, and reached to take her hand. She turned it away, not rudely, but with the steadiness of someone who had learned to tend what belonged to them. "I'm glad you could come," she said. Her voice had a thinness that surprised her, but the words were clear. "There's something I need to talk about." He settled back, watching her as if she were a play he had the right to edit. He looked briefly at Jasmine, then back at Elizabeth, and folded his hands, the gesture precise. "Sure," he said. "What's going on?" Elizabeth unsealed one of the envelopes and took out the printed lab results, letting the papers lie on the table between them like a map. She did not read them aloud at first. She let the silence do part of the work. Timothy's face flickered through shades of concern, annoyance, and a practiced protectiveness that made her stomach turn. "Dr. Chen found some discrepancies in my blood work," Elizabeth said. "She asked me to stay somewhere else for a few nights to see if the numbers changed." He gave a small, dismissing laugh. "That's doctors for you. They like to make things dramatic." Jasmine's jaw tightened. Elizabeth watched Timothy's eyes, looking for the particular inflection she had come to recognize, a softness on the surface that, if you watched long enough, revealed an architecture of control underneath. She told herself to focus on the facts. She explained the pattern. The tests, the repeat tests after she'd stayed with Jasmine, the numbers that moved toward normal when she wasn't under the same conditions. Timothy's face held a mixture of disbelief and irritation. "So, what are you implying?" he asked. "That I, tried to hurt you? That I made you sick?" "You don't have to say anything," Elizabeth said. "You can tell the same story here, if that's who you are. But I need you to answer plainly. Did you ever alter my food or my supplements? Did you ever put anything in them without telling me?" There it was, a direct question. Private exchanges had often been fogged by charm or by reinterpretation later, but witnesses changed that calculus. Timothy's lips pressed together. For a moment he simply blinked. Then he smiled in a way that suggested he would turn this back into a joke. "That's absurd," he said. "You know me better than that." The conversation could have dissolved into a simple denial. Instead, Timothy leaned forward, and the tone changed. He began to talk about care, about keeping the household running in the ways he thought best. He spoke of his decisions in the past 12 years as if they were civic duties, choosing the best vitamins, picking meals that would be easy on her pregnancy, ensuring their budget stretched to cover the new things a baby required. He framed his control as generosity, and generosity as the mask of his manipulation. "You always get anxious," he said. "I was trying to protect you from overthinking. I know how you worry. You want everything checked." The words were the kind of rationalizations Elizabeth had heard before, but something in them was new, an arrogance. Protect you from overthinking became a claim to authority. It implied that he had the right to be the arbiter of her needs. The phrasing landed in the room, and the two friends across from them leaned forward, the way people do when something fragile is about to fracture. Elizabeth felt her hands go cold. This was the admission she had hoped would never come, and the one she had feared most, the articulation of motive. She had wanted him to name it in the world, not because the words themselves were necessary, but because when a pattern is spoken aloud in public, it becomes harder for it to be erased. "So, you admit you decided what I should take?" she asked. She tried to keep her voice from cracking, tried to hold the moment like a photograph. Timothy hesitated. The practiced smile faltered and then smoothed, as if emotion could be ironed flat. "I decided to help," he said. "We needed to keep things simple. Sometimes you get overwhelmed, and I stepped in." It was not a confession in legal terms. It was an ownership of behavior without naming its harmful intent. But the shift in tone, the fact that he had justified the patterns of control as benevolence, was a kind of admission, an explanation of motive. He had described how he curated her intake, how he managed the house finances, and implied that his interventions kept her from the anxiety he said she would succumb to alone. Elizabeth let those words hang. Jasmine reached for her water, then set it down again. Two friends, who had not been asked to speak, exchanged a look that said they had heard the pattern too, but witness alone was not proof. Elizabeth took a breath and said, "I'm going to show you something else." She opened her phone and played the recording she had made earlier, a clipped voice memo where she had described the way she felt leaving the house with Timothy's meals and the rapid improvement she'd experienced after sleeping at Jasmine's. She showed the photographs of vitamin labels, the receipts of meals bought at odd hours, the notes she had kept of days when she ate what she chose and days when she had not. She slid the folder across the table, and Timothy finally looked at the paper with an expression she had never seen. A small, tight pinching in the eyes, like someone who realized their hands had left smudges on glass so long they had forgotten they were visible. "You brought all this here to shame me," he said after a moment, voice low but edged. "This is a stunt." "No," Elizabeth said. "This is evidence. I didn't want to believe it. I wanted to think these were small things. But we are about to have a child. I am not willing to risk that." Timothy's response was an odd blend of anger and wounded pride. "So what? You're going to call the police," he said, as if that were the absurd escalation. "You're going to make me the villain?" Jasmine did not hesitate. She picked up her phone and slid it across the table with a calmness that felt like an order. "You can say whatever you want," she said, "but I'm recording this. There are witnesses. If things are as bad as she says, we will call the police. She doesn't have to do this alone." At the name of the police he swore, a short, startled sound, that told them something about control. People who manage others with a mix of affection and restriction often rely on private dynamics that break down under public scrutiny. The presence of witnesses had moved the situation into a different plane. Timothy stood up abruptly, the cup in his hand clinking. "This is insane," he said. Voices around them turned. He looked at the small crowd as if it were a jury, and for a moment he played the role he had been rehearsed to play. Reasonable husband, victim of an unfounded accusation. Elizabeth watched his face closely. She did not want spectacle. She wanted accountability. She wanted the pattern exposed. She wanted protection for the baby. She also wanted, in a quieter register, for Timothy to be the person he had presented himself to be, to deny, to clarify, to apologize if he had overstepped. She had not wanted noxious cruelty. She had wanted a life in which her autonomy was respected. Instead, under the pressure of witnesses and recorded statements, Timothy's denial adopted a strain of anger that frayed into something truer. In the second half of the conversation, his language slipped. What had been a tidy narrative of "I'm helping you" fractured into an admission of control. He said his motives in a way that showed he saw dependency as a way to ensure loyalty. He described, in halting sentences, how he had altered little things to keep life predictable. For both their sakes, he said, suggesting that safety for the household required management from him. The admission was not explicit about poisoning or malice, and it need not be. It revealed intent. He claimed to have meddled with what Elizabeth ingested because he believed he knew better than she did. That phrase, "I know what's best," was the kernel of coercive control. When he articulated that premise in front of them, it was as if a map had been unfolded. Control dressed as care, a pattern of decision-making that excluded Elizabeth's agency. Jasmine's fingers were steady on her phone. She dialed the non-emergency line for the police and reported what had happened, asking for guidance. She described an interaction that contained both an allegation and a recorded statement. The woman on the line said she would dispatch someone to take a report and to remain where they were. Elizabeth felt a wave of relief, a small, practical thing, the knowledge that an institution would hear the facts and that there would be a record. When an officer arrived, the mood shifted from theatrical unpleasantness to a measured procedure. The officers spoke to Elizabeth gently, asking about safety if she feared immediate harm, and whether she wanted to press charges. They took the folder she offered, documented the recording and photographs, and took Timothy aside to ask a few pointed questions. He was polite at first, then defensive. The conversation lasted long enough that other patrons returned to their menus, the rhythm of a city life pressing against their private fracture. Under the weight of evidence they had collected, the pattern of blood work, the improvements after she had controlled her intake, the receipts, the recorded conversation. Police requested that Timothy come down to the station to answer further questions. He refused at first, attempting to maintain control of the narrative, but finally relented when officers explained that they needed to investigate potential interference with someone's food and supplements, given the risks to a pregnant woman and her fetus. His arrest was not cinematic. It was a sober, procedural act, officers reading rights, Timothy being guided into a cruiser. He looked at Elizabeth before the doors closed with an expression she could not pass. There was anger, certainly, but also a curious emptiness, as if the scaffolding that had supported his sense of authority had been dismantled in a single, ordinary afternoon. When the car drove away, the cafe felt both lighter and more raw. Elizabeth sat with Jasmine for a long time, both of them saying little. Dr. Chen's words came back to her, the way she had folded a note into Elizabeth's palm and told her to go somewhere safe that night. The doctor's suggestion that divorce could be a near-future necessity was no longer an abstract legal phrase. It was a practical option tethered to protection. Police began the investigative work. They logged the evidence, took statements, and referred the matter to the local prosecutor's office. This part of the story stretches in time in ways that are not cinematic. Appointments, forms, forensic processes that are heavy with bureaucracy but necessary. Elizabeth met with detectives who explained the scope of an investigation and the types of corroboration that could be pursued. They did not breathe promises. They said simply that the evidence would be examined, that forensic labs could analyze samples, and that the process could take weeks. In those weeks, Elizabeth learned a new kind of patience. She attended interviews, handed over the folder she'd carried into the cafe, and consented to forensic testing that she did not fully understand, but that Dr. Chen and the detectives explained in practical terms. She continued to see Dr. Chen, who remained a steady presence, careful, observant, ethically clear. The doctor did not sensationalize any step. She documented everything medically, wrote notes for the clinic files, and gently insisted on Elizabeth's ongoing access to Grace House and other supports. The doctor also continued to recommend stepping away as a way to limit variables while tests were processed. Timothy was charged with a range of offenses linked to interfering with Elizabeth's nutrition and health. The prosecutor's office sought lab analysis that would determine whether substances had been introduced into food or supplements in ways that could explain her symptoms and the blood work anomalies. Dr. Chen's clinical notes and the pattern of lab results formed part of the medical evidence. The forensic lab found tampering consistent with interference in bottles and meal preparations. The specifics were handled by experts, and for Elizabeth, the technical language mattered less than the message. The pattern Dr. Chen had suspected was corroborated. When the lab results came back corroborating interference, the legal landscape changed. Timothy's demeanor in court testimonies was different from the man at the cafe. He alternated between contrition and minimization, at times speaking of misguided motives and a desire to protect the family, at other times denying that his actions had risked anyone. His public apologies were partial. They never fully admitted to calculating harm. The prosecutors, working with the medical documentation, reached a plea agreement. Timothy would plead guilty to charges that reflected his interference and would face a sentence that included probation, mandatory counseling, and a restraining order designed to protect Elizabeth and their child. The court's role was not to perform moral theater, but to administer consequences while prioritizing safety and compensation for the harm done. Divorce followed in a separate legal process. For Elizabeth, the divorce was not about punishment so much as a formal legal separation that would erect boundaries enabling safety and autonomy. She did not take the word lightly. After 12 years, the idea of dissolving a life was mosaic and messy, but the doctor's earlier counsel had framed the possibility not as a moral failure, but as a step toward ensuring she and her child could have independent agency. The divorce provided a legal mechanism to sever financial control, to formalize custody and protection terms, and to delineate the contours of a life that no longer required her to ask permission for basic decisions. The days that followed were a mixture of mundane parenting preparations and bureaucratic negotiations. Elizabeth attended sessions with a therapist who specialized in trauma and coercive control. The therapy was a slow unfastening of habits, recognizing how dependence had been encouraged and how to rebuild a sense of self that did not require permission. She returned to work part-time when she felt able, negotiated new financial arrangements, and slowly began to feel agency coalesce in decisions she had once deferred. In the middle of these administrative and emotional shifts, Elizabeth gave birth. The delivery was long and at times tenderly ordinary. Marcus arrived with a small, indignant wail and a shock of dark hair. He was healthy. The fetus measures had not been the full story of her vulnerability, but they had been a tribute to Dr. Chen's vigilance. Holding Marcus for the first time, Elizabeth found a quietness she hadn't known she could reach. Gratitude threaded through exhaustion, relief braided with grief for what had been lost. Timothy was not present at the hospital. The restraining orders and the legal processes kept him at a distance. Elizabeth thought of the cafe, of the folded card, of the small spoon she'd left on the counter as a witness. She thought of Jasmine and Dr. Chen and the patient advocate who had helped with logistics. Without their steady hands, she did not know how she would have oriented herself. The baby's soft, urgent breathing against her chest felt like a small proof that the choices she'd made, choices measured and fearful and courageous, had been the right ones for survival. After a period of recovery, Elizabeth began to envision a life that extended beyond the immediate needs of newborn care and paperwork. For many survivors, the work of rebuilding is solitary and grinding, but Elizabeth had seen, in the months of investigation and hospital visits, a pattern she felt compelled to change, not just for herself and Marcus, but for others who might find themselves in similar, quiet traps. She thought of Dr. Chen's steady refusal to be neutral when a patient's life might be at risk, of Jasmine's insistence on presence, and of Grace House's role as a practical hub of safety. So she started to act. At first it was small. She returned to conversations with the clinic to offer her perspective to other women who might be in situations of control. She volunteered an afternoon a week at a local support group. As Marcus grew into months and then a toddling, earnest child, Elizabeth's efforts expanded. With the help of friends, the patient advocate who had helped her navigate logistics, and pro bono counsel sympathetic to survivors, she launched a small non-profit that offered a mix of practical services and storytelling, workshops on recognizing coercive control, resources for safe planning, and a confidential hotline linked to vetted shelters and legal directories. She named the non-profit Liminal Light, thinking of thresholds and the awkward, luminous place between what is and what might be. The organization was humble at first, meetings in church basements, a website crafted by a friend, a small fund for emergency nights at hotels for people who needed immediate alternatives. Elizabeth focused on creating materials that respected survivors' dignity, how to recognize patterns, how to find trusted clinical partners, and how to access community resources without stepping into advice that could be misused. She insisted that Liminal Light be a bridge rather than a prescriptive manual, one that connected people to trained advocates and clinicians who could offer personalized help. Years after Marcus's birth, the work expanded into partnerships with local clinics. Dr. Chen became a quiet ally. She would occasionally speak at Liminal Light events about the medical signs that can function as alarms without offering technical instructions that could be misused. Grace House and other shelters collaborated on training sessions that emphasized survivor agency and practical safety planning. Elizabeth's role shifted from a woman who had been protected to a leader who helped others find their own paths to safety. One day, a young woman named Kesha reached out to Elizabeth. Kesha's message was careful and brief, an email that said simply, "I think my partner is doing the same things," Elizabeth replied, as she had wanted someone to reply to her, with steadiness and resources. They met in person. Kesha was young, her hair cropped, eyes wide with a mixture of fear and determination. She had felt humiliated and ashamed in ways Elizabeth knew all too well. She had started keeping notes and had found a doctor who took her concerns seriously. The echoes between their stories were direct and painful. Elizabeth listened. She told Kesha the same simple truths she had learned. You deserve agency. Medical signs can be signals. Community matters. She did not tell Kesha what to do. She offered options, connected her to Dr. Chen's network, and arranged for a safe consultation and legal referral through Liminal Light. Kesha slept at a shelter that night. She called Elizabeth in the morning. "I didn't think I could leave," she said, "but the shelter helped me feel like I could breathe." Those years of helping others were not a cure for Elizabeth's own scars. She still had nights when a noise made her flinch, and mornings where the old shame rose unexpectedly. But the work of guiding others reframed those scars into tools. They were the maps of survival she handed to someone else, so that person might have a different route. When people asked Elizabeth why Dr. Chen had urged her to get a divorce after the ultrasound, she found herself telling the story in the simplest terms. The doctor had seen a mismatch between what the baby showed and what Elizabeth's own body reflected. The pattern suggested that something external was interfering with her health. Dr. Chen, whose job combined clinical observation with the responsibility to protect, had acted out of prudence. She had given Elizabeth options, shelter cards, referrals, documentation, because leaving for a controlled environment would both protect the pregnancy and provide the conditions necessary to gather evidence. When evidence confirmed interference, separation, and then divorce became, for Elizabeth, not an act of vengeance, but a legal tool to secure autonomy and safety for her and her child. Elizabeth often emphasized that a doctor's urgent suggestion to leave is rooted in immediate safety, not a moral judgment on the relationship. Divorce, she would say, is a legal mechanism. It can be whatever you choose to let it be, an end, a safeguard, an opening. For me, it became protection for a little boy who deserved a mother who decided for herself. She also talked about how control often disguises itself as care. "He told me he was helping me," she said in interviews and small group sessions. "That's what makes it so insidious. Care is not the issue. It's the substitution of someone else's judgment for your own." Liminal light grew slowly into a recognized community resource. Elizabeth's public profile was never a hunger for attention, but a practical means to channel funds and partnerships toward survivors. She worked with clinicians to draft training materials for recognizing medical patterns that might indicate interference without giving anyone a how-to guide. She partnered with legal clinics to create informational packets about protective orders and custody rights. Again, not prescriptive legal advice, but pathways to professional help. Occasionally, the story drew public attention. The court proceedings were covered by local media, which often prefers tidy narratives: villain, victim, redemption. Elizabeth resisted being cast as a single-note figure. She insisted on complexity. The marriage had contained genuine affection and real companionship, even as it housed control. She never framed herself as faultless, nor did she accept language that blamed victims for staying. Instead, she used interviews to argue for empathy, for systems that understood why people stay, and how to build exit routes that are practical and dignified. Years later, at a small fundraising dinner, Elizabeth watched a woman get up to speak who had once sat in the back row of a support meeting. She was quiet at first, then steadied. Her name was Lila, and she described how she had left a relationship after finding resources that helped her plan a safe exit. Her voice quivered when she mentioned Elizabeth's organization. "If not for liminal light," she said, "I don't know if I would have left." Those moments were not victories in a cinematic sense. They were confirmations that small choices compound. The doctor's note folded into Elizabeth's palm that day in the clinic had been a first tiny act that enabled a chain of choices. It became, in Elizabeth's telling, an emblem of how professional care, friendship, and a willingness to trust one's own instincts can combine to break patterns that look like love but function like containment. In quiet moments, Elizabeth still felt the residue of the years that had taught her caution. Marcus, now a lively, curious child, asked questions about the world that reminded her daily why she had chosen safety. She often sat with him on her lap and told him simple truths about boundaries and kindness. She taught him that love is respectful, that care respects choice, and that it is okay to ask for help. Her relationship with Dr. Chen remained one of professional gratitude and deep personal regard. They would meet for coffee sometimes, not as doctor and patient, but as two people who had shared a narrow, consequential period of time. Dr. Chen continued to advocate for clinic protocols that made it easier to document concerns and to refer patients to safe resources. She encouraged colleagues to listen when a patient's story contained a dissonance between fetal well-being and maternal depletion. Elizabeth worked with the clinic to create a pamphlet that offered language for patients and clinicians, simple, dignified phrasing that allowed professionals to act without assuming guilt or responsibility, but with a readiness to provide safety options. The thing Elizabeth returned to most often in her reflections was the idea of small choices that accumulate. Leaving a plate uneaten one night, sleeping at a friend's apartment, taking a folder into a cafe, calling the police. Each step, unremarkable on its own, conspired into a life-saving pattern. The doctor's urgency had been the pivot because it had provided permission to choose safety in a way that did not demand a moral judgment about the entirety of her marriage. It gave her a framework where her body's signals could be taken seriously and where the law could become a tool of protection rather than a remote abstraction. When asked how anyone can tell the difference between conflict and coercive control, Elizabeth usually answered with a patient humility. Conflict is part of human life. Control is a persistent pattern that limits autonomy and reshapes decisions to the benefit of one person at the expense of another. The difference is often visible only when someone steps back and looks at the small choices that shape daily life. Medical signs can be part of that picture because the body registers what the will tries to hide. At the end of the event, where Elizabeth told Marcus's story and the origins of liminal light, she sat for a moment with a folder on her lap. The old one she had brought into the cafe years ago, now a symbolic relic stored in the non-profit's archives. She thought of Dr. Chen's face in the clinic, of Jasmine's steady hands, and of the many nameless people who had held the necessary stations of help. Advocates, nurses, clerks, counselors, cops who had treated her with dignity, and the lab technicians who had simply done their job so the law could follow. She closed her eyes briefly and felt the arc of those years as something like a rope, frayed, tough, and threaded with both pain and unexpected kindness. The doctor's urgent words had not been a command, but an opening. Go somewhere safe tonight. Those words had given her a space to test the pattern and then to make choices that prioritized the life inside her. The subsequent suggestion that divorce might be necessary was not offered as a moral failing, but as a legal instrument for protection. Together, those pieces had allowed her to survive and, later, to transform survival into service. If you watched all the way here, you saw how a routine medical appointment can become a turning point. You saw how a clinician's careful attention and willingness to act can shift the axis of a life. You saw how small, deliberate steps can add up to escape, accountability, and new purpose. If this story mattered to you, please share it. In the description below, we've included links to vetted resources, hotlines, shelters, and organizations that can help anyone facing coercive control or abuse. If you or someone you know is in immediate danger, please contact local emergency services. No one should have to find safety alone. Elizabeth's story ends not with a tidy victory, but with a continuing commitment to hold the space for survivors, to name control when it hides as care, and to keep building bridges so others can step across into safety. The doctor's urgency, that moment in the clinic when a folded card met a hand, was the hinge. It saved a life, and years later became the seed of many more lives freed to choose for themselves.